They said he was a piece of property, a tool to be used, a pair of hands to steer a ship, a back to load cotton, an asset with a price tag but no soul. The Confederate officers who commanded the CSS Planter looked right through him every single day. To them, he was just Robert, the wheelman, a fixture of the shipper's deck, as invisible and functional as the shipper's wheel itself. They spoke freely in front of him, discussing strategy, fortifications, and minefields, secure in their arrogant belief that a black man lacked the intellect to understand the complex machinery of war. They thought his silence was submission. They thought his obedience was loyalty. They were wrong. On the night of May 13, 1862, in the dark, churning waters of Charleston Harbor, the most heavily fortified harbor in the entire Confederacy, Robert Smalls was about to pull off the greatest magic trick in the history of the Civil War. He was not just planning to run away. He was not just planning to escape into the woods. He was planning to steal a 147-foot-long, armed Confederate gunboat, sail it past 5 hostile forts under the cover of darkness, and hand it over to the United States Navy as a prize of war. It was a plan so audacious, so suicidal, and so technically complex that if you wrote it as fiction, people would call it impossible. The penalty for failure was not just prison. It was not just a beating. If caught, Smalls knew he and his crew would be executed immediately, likely blown out of the water by the massive cannons of Fort Sumter before they could even surrender. But Robert Smalls had a secret weapon, one that the white slave owners of South Carolina never accounted for. He had been watching. For 23 years, he had been studying his oppressors, learning their language, their mannerisms, and their weaknesses. And on this night, he was going to use their own arrogance to destroy them. To understand the sheer insanity of what Smalls was attempting, you have to understand Charleston, South Carolina, in 1862. This was not just a city, it was the beating heart of the rebellion. It was the place where the first shots of the war were fired. The harbor was a fortress of death, ringed by heavy artillery batteries that could pulverize any unauthorized vessel in minutes. Castle Pinckney, Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, and the terrifying Fort Sumter, these were the teeth of the Confederacy, guarding the entrance to the Atlantic. No ship moved in or out without the correct signals, the correct paperwork, and the express permission of the military command. The Union Navy was blockading the harbor from the outside, miles away in the open ocean. Between Smalls and that blockade lay 7 miles of lethal water, patrolled by Confederate gunboats and mined with torpedoes. To navigate this gauntlet, a man would need to know every sandbar, every current, and every secret code. He would need to possess nerves of absolute steel. And most importantly, he would need to be white, because no black man was allowed to pilot a ship past Fort Sumter. Robert Smalls was born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839. From the moment he took his first breath, the law defined him as a thing. But his mother, Lydia, a fierce and protective woman who worked in the master's house, refused to let him grow up with the mentality of a slave. She showed him the brutal reality of the fields, forcing him to watch slaves being whipped at the auction block, not to scare him, but to harden him. She wanted him to understand the enemy. She wanted him to hate the system enough to survive it. By the time he was a teenager, Smalls was sent to Charleston to be hired out. This was a common practice where enslaved men worked in the city, and their masters took the vast majority of their wages. Smalls started on the docks, a boy in a bustling, dangerous port city. But he had a gift. He understood the water. He rose quickly from a stevedore to a rigger, then to a sailmaker, and finally to a wheelman, a pilot in everything but name. He learned the harbor better than the men who owned him. He memorized the tides, the shifts in the sandbars, the hidden channels. He became indispensable. By 1861, when the war broke out, Smalls was assigned to the CSS Planter, a sidewheel steamer that had been converted into a military transport. The Planter was a valuable asset. It carried heavy guns, ammunition, and supplies to the forts ringing the harbor. Smalls was the man who actually steered the ship, while the white officers sat in the cabin and took the credit. He learned the whistle signals. He learned the challenge codes used by the sentries at the forts. And, most dangerously, he learned to mimic the captain. Captain C. G. Relier was a typical Confederate officer, pompous, confident, and distinct in his appearance. He wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and had a particular way of standing on the deck, a posture of command. Smalls watched him the way a predator watches prey. He studied the way Relier wore his hat, the way he folded his arms, the silhouette he cut against the night sky. Smalls realized something profound. In the dark, to a sleepy sentry 500 yards away, a silhouette is just a silhouette. If he could look like the captain, maybe, just maybe, he could become the captain. But why risk it all? Why take a chance on a mission that had a 99% probability of death? The answer lay in a small apartment in Charleston, where his wife, Hannah, and their 2 young children lived. Like him, they were enslaved. And like him, they lived under the constant, terrifying shadow of the auction block. Smalls had tried to buy his family's freedom. He had saved every penny he was allowed to keep from his wages, scraping together a few $100s. But the price of freedom was exorbitant, far beyond his reach. He realized with a cold dread that he could work for 100 years and still not save enough to buy his own children. At any moment, his master could decide to sell Hannah or the kids down the river to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, and he would never see them again. The system was rigged. There was no way to win by playing by the rules. Pause for a second and ask yourself this. If you were in his position, with your wife and children sleeping in a city that viewed them as merchandise, knowing that tomorrow they could be sold away forever, would you have the courage to risk putting them on a stolen warship and sailing into cannon fire? Or would you wait, hoping for a mercy that might never come? Let me know in the comments what you think the breaking point is for a man who has nothing to lose but his chains. For Robert Smalls, the breaking point came in April 1862. The crew of the Planter had been tense. The Union blockade was tightening. The Confederate officers were becoming paranoid. But they were also becoming complacent. Smalls noticed a pattern. When the Planter docked in Charleston for the night, the 3 white officers, Captain Relier, the pilot, and the engineer, would often leave the ship to sleep in their comfortable beds in the city, leaving the enslaved crew on board to guard the vessel. This was against military regulations, a court-martial offense, but they did it anyway. They trusted the boys. They figured, where could a bunch of slaves go with a massive steamboat? Smalls saw the opening. He gathered the crew, all enslaved men he trusted with his life. He laid out the plan. It was terrifyingly simple and incredibly dangerous. They would wait for a night when the officers were gone. They would bring their families on board, hiding them in the cargo hold. Then, Smalls would don the captain's uniform and straw hat. They would fire up the boilers, cast off the lines, and sail the Planter right down the main channel, saluting the Confederate forts as they passed. If they were stopped, they would be blown to pieces. If they made it to the open ocean, they would have to surrender to the Union blockade fleet before the Union ships blew them out of the water, mistaking them for an attacking Confederate ram. It was a suicide pact. Smalls made the crew promise one thing: if they were cornered, if the forts opened fire and escape was impossible, they would not surrender. They would ignite the ship's ammunition magazine and blow the Planter to kingdom come. They would go down as free men in a ball of fire rather than return to chains. The crew agreed. On the evening of May 12th, the Planter took on a heavy load, for massive cannons intended for a Confederate fort, along with 200 pounds of ammunition and firewood. It was a floating bomb. As night fell, the white officers, true to their habit, went ashore to a ball in the city, leaving the ship in the hands of the crew. Smalls watched them leave. He waited until their footsteps faded into the cobblestone streets. Then, he turned to his men. "This is it," he whispered. "Tonight, we are free or we are dead." The boiler fires were stoked. The pressure built. In the darkness of the cargo hold, women and children huddled together, terrified into silence, praying to a God they hoped was watching. On the bridge, Robert Smalls put on the wide-brimmed straw hat. He buttoned the captain's jacket. He stood by the wheel, taking a breath of the heavy, humid air. He was no longer property. For the next 4 hours, he was the captain of the CSS Planter. He reached for the cord to sound the whistle, the signal that would tell the sentries he was authorized to leave. His hand trembled for a fraction of a second, then steadied. He pulled the cord. Woo-woo. The sound echoed across the silent harbor. The lines were cast off. The massive paddle wheels began to churn the black water. Robert Smalls turned the prow of the ship toward the Atlantic, toward the guns of Fort Sumter, and steered his way into history. The paddle wheels churned the dark water of the Cooper River, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. To the crew of the Planter, every creak of the timber, every hiss of the steam engine sounded like a scream. They were moving. There was no turning back now. But before they could run the gauntlet of the forts, there was one crucial, heart-stopping detour to make. The plan dictated that they pick up the women and children at the West Atlantic Wharf, a short distance away. This was the first major risk. Docking a military vessel in the middle of the night was suspicious enough. Loading it with civilians was a death sentence if spotted. Smalls guided the ship alongside the wharf with the gentle touch of a master pilot. In the shadows, the figures of Hannah Smalls, their children, and the families of the other crew members were waiting. They moved like ghosts, terrified and silent. There were no tearful reunions, no words of comfort. Just the frantic, hushed shuffling of feet on the gangplank. Smalls watched from the wheelhouse, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw his daughter, barely a toddler, being carried aboard. He knew that if he made a mistake in the next hour, she would die in a fireball. The thought did not paralyze him. It focused him into a state of icy clarity. Once the families were hidden below decks, deep in the cargo hold where the heat of the boilers was suffocating, Smalls turned the Planter back into the channel. Now the real game began. They had to pass 4 Confederate checkpoints. Each one was a test. Each one required the correct steam whistle signal. Blow it too long, or too short, or too loud, and the sentries would know something was wrong. And if the sentries signaled an alarm, the crossfire from the batteries would turn the wooden steamer into splinters in seconds. The first challenge was the guard boat anchored in the harbor. Smalls approached it casually, throttling down the engines to a slow, steady pace. He pulled the whistle cord, 2 long blasts and 1 short. It was the standard pass signal. The guard boat did not move. No flares went up. They drifted past in the gloom, just another Confederate transport doing night work. 1 down. Next came Fort Johnson. The massive silhouette of the fortification loomed out of the darkness on their right. The soldiers on the ramparts were awake. Smalls could see the faint glow of their lanterns. Again, he sounded the whistle. The steam screamed into the night air, a sound that felt like it would wake the dead. Smalls stood rigid in the wheelhouse, wearing the captain's wide-brimmed straw hat and long overcoat. He adopted Captain Relia's signature stance, arms crossed over his chest, leaning slightly back, exuding an air of bored arrogance. He knew the sentries could not see his face, but they could see his outline. He had to be the white captain. The signal was acknowledged. They sailed on. But the ultimate boss battle lay ahead. Fort Sumter. Sumter was not just a fort. It was a monster. It sat on an island at the mouth of the harbor, a brooding, stone-faced killer that controlled all access to the Atlantic. Its walls bristled with heavy columbiads and mortars. This was the most heavily guarded spot in the entire Confederacy. And to make matters worse, the timing was slipping. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. The cloak of darkness, Small's greatest ally, was fraying. If the light caught his face, if a sentry looked through a spyglass and saw a black man wearing the captain's coat, the game was over. As the Planter approached Sumter, the crew in the engine room began to panic. Some of them wanted to turn back. Others whispered about igniting the powder magazine right then and there. Smalls hissed orders down the speaking tube, Stay at your posts. Trust me. He steered the ship dangerously close to the fort. This was a psychological gambit. A guilty man would try to steer wide, to keep his distance. An arrogant Confederate captain, secure in his authority, would cut the corner. Smalls steered the planter so close to the walls that the sentry on the parapet could practically have tossed a coin onto the deck. The air was thick with tension. The water slapped against the hull. Smalls reached for the whistle cord one last time. His hand was steady. He blew the code, the specific, secret signal required for passing Sumter. Then, he waited. Seconds ticked by like hours. The sentry on the wall did not respond immediately. Had he seen something? Was he reaching for the alarm bell? Was he leveling a musket? Inside the wheelhouse, Smalls muttered a prayer, or perhaps a curse. Below decks, the women held their breath, clutching their children so tight it hurt. Then, a voice drifted across the water from the fortress ramparts. Past the planter. The sentry waved. To him, it was just the reliable old planter, heading out early for the morning patrol. He shouted, "Blow the damned Yankees to hell, Captain." Smalls did not break character. He raised a hand in a lazy, officer-like salute, mimicking the casual dismissal Relier often gave the enlisted men. He shouted back, "Aye, aye." The heavy wooden gates of the harbor were effectively open. They had passed Sumter. They were technically out of the trap. But Smalls knew the danger was not over. It had just changed shape. If he immediately gunned the engines and raced for the open sea, the sentries at Sumter would realize something was wrong. Why would a transport ship sprint toward the enemy blockade? They would fire their massive cannons, and at this range, they would not miss. So, Smalls forced himself to maintain a slow, agonizingly leisurely pace. He kept the ship on its standard patrol trajectory, heading parallel to the coast, just drifting. It was the longest 10 minutes of his life. He could feel the eyes of the fort boring into his back. He watched the distance widen, yard by excruciating yard. Finally, when the planter was just out of effective cannon range, Smalls dropped the act. He spun the wheel hard. "Full steam ahead," he shouted. "Give me everything you've got." The planter surged forward, black smoke pouring from its stack, turning its nose directly toward the line of Union warships waiting on the horizon. But now, they faced a new terror. The Union blockade fleet. To the sailors on the USS Onward, a Union clipper ship patrolling the blockade, the approaching vessel looked like a nightmare. It was a Confederate ram, charging out of the mist at full speed, flying the rebel flag, which Smalls had kept up to fool the forts. It looked like an attack. Captain J.F. Nichols of the Onward did not hesitate. He ordered his gun crews to general quarters. The heavy port guns were run out. The men swiveled them toward the oncoming planter. They were seconds away from blowing Smalls and his family out of the water. It would be the ultimate tragedy, to escape the slave masters only to be killed by the liberators. On the deck of the planter, chaos erupted. Smalls knew they were about to be fired upon. He ordered the Confederate flag struck down. But where was the white flag? In the panic, they could not find it. The Union guns were tracking them. The distance was closing. Finally, Hannah Smalls, holding her child with one hand, grabbed a white bedsheet she had brought from the hotel where she worked. She handed it to the crew. They scrambled up the mast, tearing down the stars and bars and frantically hoisting the dirty white sheet. It caught the wind just as the gunnery officer on the Onward was about to give the order to fire. Captain Nichols peered through his spyglass. He saw the sheet. He saw the paddle wheeler slowing down. He saw the dark faces crowding the deck, men and women jumping and waving, not in aggression, but in jubilation. He ordered his men to stand down. The planter drifted alongside the Onward. The silence of the morning was broken not by cannon fire, but by a voice, Robert Small's voice, ringing out across the water, clear and strong. He took off the captor's hat, the symbol of his deception, and threw it on the deck. He looked up at the white Union captain and shouted a line that belongs in the pantheon of American history. "Good morning, sir. I have brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." The sheer shock on the faces of the Union sailors must have been absolute. They were expecting a Confederate raiding party. Instead, they found a ship full of laughing, crying, dancing black families. They found a prize of war delivered to them on a silver platter by a man who was legally considered chattel. As Smalls stepped aboard the Union ship, he was not just a runaway slave anymore. He was a man who had just outsmarted the entire Confederate military apparatus. He had handed the Union a working warship for heavy cannons, valuable intelligence on the harbor's defenses, and the secret codebook used by the Confederate Signal Corps. It was an intelligence coup of massive proportions. But more than the hardware, he had delivered a message that would reverberate all the way to the White House. He had proven, in one night, that the enslaved were not passive victims waiting to be saved. They were active, intelligent, and daring agents of their own liberation. The captain of the Onward shook his hand. The crew cheered. But as the adrenaline faded, Robert Smalls looked back toward the shoreline, toward the smoke rising from Fort Sumter. He knew that back in Charleston, the alarm was finally ringing. He knew that Captain Relier was waking up to find his ship gone and his career ruined. He knew that the slave owners were realizing that their loyal Robert had played them for fools. Robert Smalls had won his freedom. But he was not done. He had not just stolen a ship to escape the war, he had stolen a ship to join it. And he had a very specific request for the Union Navy. He did not just want to be free. He wanted to keep his ship. He wanted to be the captain. And he wanted to go back and use those guns against the men who had enslaved him. The impossible heist was over. The legend of Captain Smalls was just beginning. And the Confederacy was about to find out that the man they thought was a wheelman was actually a wolf in sheepish clothing, and he was coming back to hunt. The sun rose over a divided nation that morning, and by noon, the name Robert Smalls was on the lips of everyone from the dockworkers in New York to the plantation owners in Mississippi. In the North, the story hit the newspapers like a thunderclap. It was the kind of morale boost the Union desperately needed. The New York Tribune, Harper's Weekly, and the New York Times ran breathless accounts of the daring colored pilot who had snatched a Confederate warship from under the very noses of the rebels. For a northern public that had been fed a steady diet of racist propaganda claiming that enslaved people were docile, content, or too cowardly to fight for their own freedom, Smalls was a revelation. He was dashing, he was articulate, and he was undeniably brave. He became the first black folk hero of the war. In the South, the reaction was a mixture of apoplectic rage and profound humiliation. The Confederate High Command was stunned. How could a boy, as they dismissively called him, outsmart their best officers? General Roswell Ripley, the Confederate commander in Charleston, was furious. He knew that the loss of the planter was not just embarrassing, it was a tactical disaster. Smalls had not just stolen a boat, he had stolen the playbook. The planter was a shallow draft vessel, capable of navigating the winding, treacherous rivers and inlets that larger Union ships could not reach. It was the perfect tool for infiltrating Confederate territory. And now, the Union had it, along with a pilot who knew every inch of that territory better than the men who had drawn the maps. A bounty was immediately placed on Smalls' head. The Confederate government promised a fortune to anyone who could capture him or bring back his corpse. He was no longer just a runaway, he was a traitor to the South, a dangerous symbol that had to be extinguished before other enslaved men got the same idea. But Smalls did not go into hiding. He did not take his freedom and run to Canada. He did exactly what he told the Union captain he would do. He went to work. Admiral Samuel DuPont, the commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, realized immediately that Smalls was the most valuable intelligence asset he had ever acquired. Smalls sat down with the admiral and laid out the secrets of Charleston Harbor. He revealed the exact location of the Confederate torpedoes, mines, in the shipping channels. He identified which forts were undermanned. And, most critically, he told them about the Stono Inlet. The Confederates had been building fortifications along the Stono River to protect the southern approach to Charleston. But Smalls knew a secret. They had recently abandoned those positions to redeploy troops elsewhere, leaving the back door to Charleston wide open. The Union had been too afraid to probe the area, assuming it was a death trap. Smalls told them, "It's empty. You can walk right in." Based on his word alone, the Union Navy moved. They sailed into the Stono Inlet, found the forts abandoned just as Smalls had said, and established a foothold on James Island. This maneuver paved the way for the assault on Secessionville and tightened the noose around Charleston. Smalls had been free for less than a week, and he had already reshaped the strategic map of the war. But his war was not just military, it was political. The Union was still debating the Negro question. Should black men be allowed to fight? Lincoln was hesitant, fearing he would alienate the border states. The generals were skeptical. Smalls became the living argument for the affirmative. He was sent to Washington, D.C., along with the white crew of the Onward who had received him, to meet with the highest levels of government. Imagine the scene: Robert Smalls, who had been a piece of property weeks earlier, walking into the White House to meet Abraham Lincoln. He stood before the president not with his hat in his hand, eyes cast down, but as a man who had brought a warship as a gift. He looked Lincoln in the eye and told him, "Mr. President, the colored man is ready to fight. We are not children. We are men. Give us guns, and we will help you save this Union." His testimony, along with the undeniable fact of his deed, helped tip the scales. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was charmed and impressed by Smalls' intelligence. Weeks after Smalls' arrival in Washington, the War Department issued the order authorizing the raising of the first black regiments in South Carolina. The 1st and 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, later the 33rd and 34th USCT, were formed. Robert Smalls did not just free himself, he helped unlock the door for 200,000 other black soldiers to enter the fight. Smalls returned to South Carolina a hero, commissioned as a pilot in the Union Navy. He was assigned back to the Planter, which had been refitted as a Union transport. For the next year, he piloted the ship through the very waters he had escaped, ferrying troops and supplies, clearing mines he himself had helped lay, and engaging in firefights with Confederate batteries. He was fighting his former masters with their own ship. But his greatest test of courage was yet to come. It happened on December 1st, 1863, during a supply mission near Secessionville. The Planter was sailing up a narrow inlet, carrying supplies for the Union troops on the front lines. The ship came under a sudden, withering crossfire from Confederate batteries hidden in the tree line. Shells slammed into the water around them. Rifle fire pinged off the smokestacks. The captain of the Planter at this time was a white officer named Captain Nickerson. As the enemy fire intensified, panic seized him. He saw the Confederate trap closing. He knew that if they were captured, the white officers might be treated as prisoners of war, but the black crew, and especially the infamous Robert Smalls, would be summarily executed. But instead of fighting, Nickerson broke. His nerve failed him completely. According to witness accounts, Captain Nickerson ran from the wheelhouse. He shouted to the crew to surrender. "Strike the colors," he screamed. "Lower the flag. We surrender." He then fled below decks, intending to hide in the coal bunker, the safest, darkest place on the ship, leaving the crew to their fate. Robert Smalls stood on the bridge. He saw the white captain running. He heard the order to surrender. And he knew exactly what surrender meant for him. It meant a rope. It meant his wife and children would be sold or killed. It meant the end of everything. Smalls looked at the black crewmen, who were terrified and looking to him for guidance. He did not hesitate. No, he roared over the sound of the cannons. "We do not surrender." Smalls stepped to the wheel. He ordered the crew to ignore the captain. "Put on every ounce of steam," he shouted down to the engine room. "If we go down, We go down fighting. But we are not going back to chains. With shells exploding around the paddle wheels, Smalls steered the planter directly through the kill zone. He did not lower the flag. He kept it flying high, a defiant target. He maneuvered the ship with the supernatural skill of a man who knew the currents better than his own heartbeat. The Confederate gunners poured everything they had at him, but Smalls danced the heavy steamer through the splashes of artillery fire. He guided the ship out of range, saving the vessel, the cargo, and the lives of every man on board, including the coward hiding in the coal bunker. When they reached safety, the story of Nickerson's cowardice and Smalls' heroism spread through the fleet. The Navy had a problem. They could not keep a white captain who had tried to surrender a ship that a black pilot had saved. Captain Nickerson was quietly dismissed for cowardice in the face of the enemy. And then, the Union Navy did something unprecedented. Something that defied centuries of military tradition and racial prejudice. They promoted Robert Smalls. He was named the captain of the CSS Planter. Let that sink in. In 1863, in the middle of a war fought over the premise that black people were inferior, a black man was given command of a United States military vessel. He was the first African American to captain a ship in the service of the United States. He was paid a captain's wage, $1.50 a month, a fortune for a former slave. He had the authority to give orders to white subordinates. He had the power of life and death over his crew. Captain Robert Smalls. It was a title that rang out like a bell of freedom. He spent the rest of the war patrolling the coast, leading missions, and acting as a symbol of what was possible. When General Sherman began his famous march to the sea, bringing fire and ruin to the heart of the Confederacy, it was Robert Smalls and the planter that helped resupply his army in Savannah. When the war finally ended in April 1865, Robert Smalls was there to see the ultimate victory. On April 14, 1865, a ceremony was held at Fort Sumter to raise the American flag over the fort that had started the war. The very fort Smalls had sailed past in terror 3 years earlier. The planter was there, part of the Victory Fleet, and at the helm, wearing his captain's uniform, stood Robert Smalls. He watched as the stars and stripes went up the pole. The harbor was filled with ships, but his was unique. It was the only ship in the fleet that had been stolen from the enemy by its own captain. The war was over. Robert Smalls had won. He had wealth, he had fame, and he had rank. Most men would have retired, moved north, and lived out their days in comfort. But Robert Smalls was not most men. He looked at his home state of South Carolina, a land burned and broken by war, a land where millions of newly freed people were wandering, confused and hungry, facing a white population that hated them. He knew the shooting war was done, but the war for the soul of America was just starting. He turned the planter toward the dock one last time. He paid off his crew. And then he walked off the ship and straight into the most dangerous arena of all, politics in the Reconstruction South. He had conquered the water. Now, he intended to conquer the land. And his first act as a civilian would be to buy a house. But not just any house. He was going to buy the house of the man who had once owned him. The house at 511 Prince Street in Beaufort, South Carolina, was a beautiful thing. It had wide piazzas, tall white pillars, and a garden that smelled of jasmine and magnolia. For decades, it had been the seat of the McKee family, Henry McKee, the man who had owned Robert Smalls. It was the house where Smalls had played in the yard as a child, while his mother worked in the kitchen. It was the house where he had stood with his head bowed, waiting for orders. It was a monument to the old order, a physical structure built on the foundation of black labor and white supremacy. In 1866, the house went up for auction. The McKee family, ruined by the war they had supported, could no longer pay their taxes. A crowd gathered to bid on the prime real estate. But when the gavel fell, the winner was not a northern carpetbagger or a surviving Confederate aristocrat. It was Robert Smalls. The former slave bought his former master's mansion for roughly $600. It was the ultimate act of poetic justice. Smalls moved his family into the main bedrooms. He sat on the porch where he had once been forbidden to sit. He ate in the dining room where he had once served food. But Smalls did not use his new power for vengeance. In a gesture that stunned the white community of Beaufort, he allowed the former mistress of the house, Jane McKee, who was now elderly and destitute, to continue living there. He did not treat her as a servant. He treated her with a grace she had never shown him. It was a power move of the highest order. He proved that he was not just equal to his former masters in wealth, but superior to them in humanity. But Smalls knew that buying a house was not enough. He needed to build a world where that house could be safe. He looked around South Carolina and saw a state in chaos. The old Confederate leadership was defeated, but they were not gone. They were reorganizing, seething with resentment, waiting for the moment to strike back. Smalls realized that the only way to protect the freedom he had won was to seize political power. He threw himself into the work of reconstruction. He learned to read and write, hiring tutors and studying late into the night, realizing that literacy was the key to legislation. In 1868, he was a delegate to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention. This was a revolutionary gathering. For the first time in history, black men sat alongside white men to write the laws of the land. And Robert Smalls was one of the loudest voices in the room. He fought for a radical idea: universal, compulsory, public education. He argued that the only way to lift the state out of poverty was to educate every single child, black and white. The white delegates fought him. They did not want their tax dollars paying for black schools. But Smalls, the master tactician, outmaneuvered them. He helped enshrine the right to a free education in the state constitution. It was his greatest legislative victory. Every child in South Carolina who goes to a public school today, regardless of their race, owes a debt to the former boat pilot who demanded they be taught to read. Smalls rose like a rocket. He served in the State House, then the State Senate. He became a Major General in the South Carolina National Guard. And then, in 1874, he achieved the unthinkable. He was elected to the United States Congress. Imagine the scene. Robert Smalls, a man who had been a runaway slave with a bounty on his head just 12 years earlier, walking onto the floor of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. He wore a crisp suit, his posture erect, his gaze steady. He sat in the same chamber as men who had once argued that he was subhuman. He introduced bills to desegregate the military, arguing that if a black man could die for his country, he should be able to serve in any unit he chose. He fought for the rights of the black community in Port Royal. He was the living embodiment of the promise of America. But as Smalls rose, a dark shadow was lengthening across the South. The white supremacists of South Carolina had realized that they could not defeat men like Smalls at the ballot box. Black voters outnumbered whites in many districts. So, they decided to change the rules of the game. They decided to stop counting votes and start counting bodies. They called themselves the Red Shirts. Unlike the Ku Klux Klan, who hid behind white hoods and attacked at night, the Red Shirts operated in the open. They were the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, which, at the time, was the party of the white South. They were Confederate veterans, sharpshooters, and young thugs, all wearing distinctive red flannel shirts to make themselves visible and terrifying. Their strategy was simple: the shotgun policy. They would show up at political rallies, hundreds of them, heavily armed on horseback. They would not necessarily shoot, they would just stand there, watching, aiming, intimidating. They wanted to provoke a reaction. They wanted black voters to be too terrified to leave their homes. They wanted to turn Election Day into a war zone. In the election of 1876, the campaign for Smalls' re-election became a battleground. Smalls traveled from town to town, speaking to crowds of freedmen. At every stop, the Red Shirts were there. They would surround the stage, heckling him, waving their rifles, shouting threats. "We LL kill you, Smalls," they would scream. "We LL sink you like the planter." One night, at a rally in Edgefield, the tension snapped. The Red Shirts surged forward, threatening to storm the platform. Small's supporters, many of them black veterans of the Union Army, raised their own weapons. It was a standoff. One shot would have triggered a massacre. Smalls stepped to the front of the stage. He did not flinch. He looked out at the sea of angry white faces, men who wanted him dead. He did not speak as a politician. He spoke as the captain. "I have smelled the powder of battle," he roared, his voice cutting through the noise. "I have steered a ship through the cannon fire of Fort Sumter. Do you think I am afraid of you?" The red shirts hesitated. They were bullies, used to fear. They were not used to a black man looking down the barrel of a gun and smiling. Smalls held the crowd. He finished his speech. He walked through the mob to his carriage, his head high, untouched. But personal courage was not enough to stop the tide. The election of 1876 was one of the most corrupt and violent in American history. In South Carolina, the red shirts stuffed ballot boxes, assassinated black leaders, and physically blocked freedmen from voting. In some districts, there were more votes cast than there were people living in the county. Despite the terror, Robert Smalls won his seat. But his party, the Republicans, lost the state. The white supremacists, led by former Confederate General Wade Hampton, seized the governorship. And in Washington, a corrupt backroom deal was made that would seal the fate of black America for the next century. It was called the Compromise of 1877. The presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden was deadlocked. To break the tie, the Republicans agreed to a devilish bargain. If the Democrats allowed Hayes to become president, the Republicans would withdraw all federal troops from the South. Robert Smalls stood on the floor of Congress and watched it happen. He watched as the Northern politicians, the men who had cheered his theft of the planter, decided that they were tired of protecting black rights. He watched as they abandoned the freedmen to the mercy of their former masters. He warned them. He told them that they were handing the South back to the very men who had tried to destroy the Union. "You are sacrificing us," he said. "You are surrendering in peace what you won in war." But they did not listen. The troops marched out. The Reconstruction era ended. The lights went out in South Carolina. Suddenly, Robert Smalls was no longer a powerful leader in a new South. He was a man behind enemy lines again. The red shirts took off their uniforms and put on the robes of judges and sheriffs. They controlled the courts, the police, and the election boards. And they had a new target. They did not just want to defeat Robert Smalls, they wanted to destroy him. They wanted to humiliate the man who had humiliated them. They fabricated charges. They accused him of taking a bribe of $5,000 while he was in the state Senate. It was a lie, a transparent frame-up orchestrated by the very men who were stealing elections by the thousands. But the jury was white. The judge was a former Confederate. The verdict was predetermined. Robert Smalls, the hero of the planter, the congressman, the general, was convicted of corruption. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was facing the chain gang. The plan was perfect. By making him a felon, they would strip him of his ability to hold office. They would tarnish his name forever. They would show every black person in South Carolina that even the great Captain Smalls could be broken. But they forgot one thing. Robert Smalls had escaped Fort Sumter. He had escaped the blockade. He had escaped the red shirts. He was the greatest escape artist in American history. And he had one more trick up his sleeve. He was not going to prison. He was going to Washington. And he was going to fight the conviction all the way to the Supreme Court if he had to. The walls were closing in, but the captain was still at the wheel. And he had no intention of striking the colors. The prison cell was waiting. The uniform of the convict was ready. The white supremacists of South Carolina had scripted the end of Robert Smalls' story. The hero of the planter would die in chains, a disgraced felon, a warning to any other black man who dared to reach for power. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed Smalls would accept their verdict. They assumed that a black man in the South had no recourse against a white jury. They forgot that Robert Smalls had friends in high places, and more importantly, he had a constitutional case that terrified them. Smalls appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court of the United States. His lawyers argued that the state of South Carolina had violated his rights, that the jury selection had been rigged, and that the charges were politically motivated fabrication. This sent a wave of panic through the Democratic establishment in South Carolina. They realized that if the Supreme Court took the case, the federal justices might not just overturn Smalls' conviction, they might strike down the entire corrupt legal system the Redshirts had built to maintain power. They risked exposing their legal coup to federal intervention. So, they blinked. In a cynical move designed to save their own skins, the governor of South Carolina offered Smalls a full pardon before the Supreme Court could hear the case. It was a trap disguised as mercy. By accepting the pardon, Smalls would stay out of prison, but the conviction would technically remain on his record, a stain they could point to forever. "He is a criminal," they would say. "We just forgave him." Smalls knew the game. He knew it was unfair, but he also knew that he could not fight for his people from a prison cell. He accepted the pardon. He walked free, and he went right back to Washington. For the next decade, Robert Smalls became a political miracle. He was a black man getting elected to Congress from a state where white supremacists controlled the guns, the courts, and the ballot boxes. How did he do it? He was simply too loved, too respected, and too smart to be beaten. In his home district around Beaufort, the black population was vast and loyal. They would walk 20 miles to vote for the general. They would wait in line for days. The Redshirts tried to intimidate them, but in Beaufort, the veterans of the Union Army shot back. It was an island of resistance in a sea of terror. Frustrated, the Democrats decided that if they could not beat Smalls, they would erase his voters. In 1882, they orchestrated one of the most blatant acts of gerrymandering in American history. They redrew the congressional map, taking every major black community in the state and stitching them together into a single, bizarrely shaped district that snaked across the map like a constrictor. It was called the Shoestring District. The plan was to pack all the black votes into one district, conceding that seat to Smalls, while ensuring that every other district in the state would be safely white. They tried to quarantine his power. It worked, to a degree. Smalls kept his seat, but his influence was contained. He watched as his allies in other districts were swept away, replaced by men who openly preached hatred. He was becoming the last man standing, a living monument to a dying era. And then, from the swamps of resentment, rose a man who would become the architect of American apartheid. His name was Benjamin Tillman, but everyone called him Pitchfork Ben. He was the antithesis of Robert Smalls. Smalls was dignified, articulate, and believed in the Constitution. Tillman was a one-eyed, violent demagogue who bragged about murdering black men. He rode to power on a wave of populist rage, telling poor white farmers that their problems were caused by black domination. He did not just want to defeat black politicians, he wanted to dehumanize them. Tillman looked at Robert Smalls and saw everything he hated. A black man who lived in a mansion. A black man who commanded respect in Washington. It was intolerable. Tillman set out to rewrite the South Carolina Constitution with a single, explicit goal: to strip every black man of the right to vote, forever. In 1895, a constitutional convention was called in Columbia. The outcome was rigged from the start. The hall was packed with Tillman as supporters. But there, in the middle of the hostile crowd, sat 6 black delegates. And leading them was the old lion, Robert Smalls. He was 56 years old now. His hair was grey. The Civil War was a distant memory, but he had one more fight left in him. The convention was a sham. Tillman introduced literacy tests and poll taxes, measures designed specifically to disqualify black voters who had been denied education for centuries, while creating grandfather clauses to ensure illiterate whites could still vote. It was a legalistic puzzle designed to bypass the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. On October 26, 1895, Robert Smalls rose to speak. The room fell silent. Even the men who hated him could not help but look. He stood there, a former slave who had stolen a warship, a man who had served 5 terms in Congress, and he delivered a speech that should be carved into the walls of the Capitol. He did not scream. He did not beg. He dismantled their arguments with cold, hard logic. He looked at Tillman and said, "I was born and raised in South Carolina, and today I live on the very spot where I was born. I have served this state in war and in peace. My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." He offered them a compromise. He proposed a simple, fair literacy test that would apply equally to white and black voters. He knew that if the rule was applied fairly, black voters would eventually catch up. He exposed their hypocrisy. He forced them to admit, on the record, that they did not care about literacy or good government. They cared about white power. Tillman sneered at him. He rejected the compromise. The new Constitution was passed. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Before 1895, there were over 130,000 registered black voters in South Carolina. After Tillman's Constitution took effect, that number dropped to less than 5,000. It was a political genocide. With the stroke of a pen, Robert Smalls and his people were stripped of the citizenship they had earned with their blood. Smalls walked out of that convention hall a man without a country. The federal government, which he had served so faithfully, did nothing. The Supreme Court did nothing. The North looked away. The long night of Jim Crow had fully descended. But Robert Smalls did not break. He did not flee to the North, as many others did. He returned to Beaufort. He returned to the house on Prince Street. And he decided that if he could not save the state, he would save his town. For the next 20 years, Smalls ruled Beaufort like a benevolent king in exile. He was appointed the Collector of Customs for the port of Beaufort, a federal position that gave him authority and a steady income. He used that position to build a wall of protection around his community. While the rest of the South sank into the terror of lynching and segregation, Beaufort remained a strange, stubborn anomaly. Black people owned businesses. They owned land. They held local offices. The police force remained integrated long after other towns had purged their black officers. Smalls used his connections in Washington to block the worst excesses of the Jim Crow laws from reaching his doorstep. He was the king of Beaufort. When he walked down the street, white men tipped their hats to him, not out of love, but out of a grudging respect for a power they could not quite crush. He famously stopped a lynch mob in its tracks simply by showing up. A group of white thugs had cornered 2 black men, accusing them of a crime. Smalls arrived in his carriage. He stepped out, an old man with a white mustache and eyes that had seen the cannons of Fort Sumter. He told the mob to go home. And they did. They knew that Robert Smalls was not a man to be trifled with, even in his old age. He spent his final years sitting on the piazza of his master's house, watching the ships pass in the harbor. He told his story to anyone who would listen, warning the younger generation that freedom is fragile. He watched as the world changed, as cars replaced carriages, as a new century dawned. But he also watched with sadness as the history of what he and his generation had accomplished was systematically erased. The history books were rewritten to portray Reconstruction as a disaster and the Klan as heroes. He saw his own name fading from the national conversation, but he never lost his wit or his fire. Once, 2 young white men, visitors from the North, were walking past his house. They saw the elderly Smalls sitting on the porch and, assuming he was a servant, called out, "Uncle, tell us who owns this fine house." Robert Smalls stood up. He leaned over the railing, smiled that same smile he had flashed at the Union captain 40 years earlier, and said, "This house is owned by Robert Smalls. And I am he." He died in 1915, at the age of 75. His funeral was the largest in the history of Beaufort. He was buried behind the Tabernacle Baptist Church, under a stone that he himself had chosen. It did not list his rank. It did not list his political offices. It bore a simple inscription, a quote from one of his speeches that summed up his entire impossible life. "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." He was gone. And for a long time, America tried to forget him. They took his name off schools. They ignored his legislative achievements. They tried to turn him into a footnote. But a man who steals a warship is hard to hide forever. And now, as we look back at his life, we can see the final, triumphant irony of Robert Smalls. He did not just escape slavery. He bought it out. He did not just fight the system. He infiltrated it, legislated it, and when it turned on him, he outlived it. But the story of Robert Smalls is not just a history lesson. It is a challenge. Because the fight he fought, the fight for the vote, the fight for education, the fight against those who would rewrite history to suit their own power, is not over. The red shirts are gone, but their playbook remains. And the question that Robert Smalls left us with is as urgent today as it was on the deck of the Planter. When the odds are impossible, when the laws are against you, and when the whole world tells you to surrender, do you strike the colors? Or do you put on full steam and sail straight into the fire? We stand today in the shadow of a history that is constantly being rewritten. In the century following Robert Smalls' death, the forces of the lost cause, the propaganda machine of the Old South, worked tirelessly to ensure that you would know the name of Robert E. Lee, but not the name of Robert Smalls. They erected statues to the traitors in every town square. They named military bases after the men who fought to destroy the United States. They filled the history textbooks with romanticized lies about states' rights and gallant gentlemen, while relegating the actual heroes of the war, the black men who saved the Union, to the margins. For decades, they succeeded. The name of the man who stole a warship became a trivia question, a local rumor in Beaufort, rather than a central pillar of American identity. But truth has a way of outliving lies. The statues of the Confederates are coming down, their metal melting back into the obscurity they deserve. And as the dust clears, Robert Smalls is still standing. His legacy is not just a story of the past, it is a blueprint for the present. When we look at his life, we see the absolute refutation of every excuse, every hesitation, and every justification for inaction that plagues us today. Robert Smalls teaches us that audacity is a weapon. He did not wait for the Union Army to come and save him. He did not wait for a proclamation from the President. He saw a gap in the enemy's defenses, a literal and metaphorical opening in the harbor, and he took it. He understood that freedom is not something that is granted by a benevolent authority. It is something that must be seized with both hands. In a world that constantly tells black people to wait their turn, to be patient, to trust the process, Smalls offers a different answer: take the wheel. Steer the ship yourself. His life also destroys the myth of the unqualified black leader. The white officers of the Confederacy thought he was too simple-minded to pilot a ship. He navigated it better than they did. The white politicians of South Carolina thought he was too uneducated to write laws. He learned to read and wrote the constitutional amendment that guaranteed education for their own children. He proved, over and over again, that merit is often just a code word used by the privileged to protect their positions from those they fear. When given a level playing field, or even a rigged one, Smalls did not just compete, he dominated. And consider the physical legacy he left behind. The house at 511, Prince Street in Beaufort is still there. It stands today as a National Historic Landmark. It is one of the most powerful symbols in the United States. Think about the energy of that place. A house built by slave labor, occupied by a slave master, and then conquered, legally and financially, by the very man it tried to enslave. It is a monument to the ultimate W. It is a reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice only when strong hands reach up and pull it. But the most urgent lesson from Robert Smalls concerns the fragility of progress. We like to believe that history moves in a straight line, always getting better, always getting freer. Smalls' life proves that this is a lie. He saw the unimaginable progress of the 1860s, slavery abolished, black men voting, black men in Congress. And then he saw it all snatched away in the 1890s. He watched as rights that had been won in blood were erased by ink. He watched as the Supreme Court gutted the protections of the 14th Amendment. He watched as his people were pushed back into the shadows for another 70 years. This is the warning he shouts to us from the grave. Rights are not permanent. The vote is not guaranteed. Education is not safe. The forces that want to roll back progress, the spiritual descendants of the red shirts and pitchfork Ben Tillman, are always waiting. They do not wear red flannel shirts anymore. They wear suits, they sit on school boards, and they host cable news shows. They are the ones banning books that tell Smalls' story. They are the ones gerrymandering districts to dilute the power of the minority vote, just like the shoestring district of 1882. They are the ones arguing that teaching the truth about American racism is divisive. Robert Smalls fought these same battles. He fought against the suppression of the vote. He fought for public schools. He fought against the rewriting of history. He lost the battle for his state in his lifetime, but he refused to surrender the war for his dignity. Today, there is a movement to finally give him his due. In 2004, the U.S. Navy named a ship the USS Robert Smalls. It was the first time a ship had been named for him, and it was a powerful, if belated, honor. But a ship is not enough. A statue was finally erected in Charleston, but it stands in a city still dotted with monuments to his oppressors. The real monument to Robert Smalls must be built by us. It must be built by refusing to let his story be erased again. Every time we share this story, we are striking a blow against the lost cause. Every time we teach a child that a black man commanded a United States warship in 1863, we are dismantling the myth of inferiority. Every time we vote, we are using the weapon he fought to put in our hands. Imagine if every American child knew the name Robert Smalls as well as they know the name George Washington. Imagine if his face was on the $20 bill. Imagine if his strategy of audacious compliance, using the rules of the system to destroy the system, was taught in every business school and political science class. That is the world we should be building. He was the unwanted black captain. The unwanted black congressman. The man the system tried to crush, jail, and forget. But look at the scoreboard. The Confederacy is dead. Its flag is a symbol of hate and failure. Its generals are being removed from their pedestals. But Robert Smalls? Robert Smalls is rising. The ship he stole, the Planter, was eventually scrapped, its timbers rotting away in the marshes. But the spirit of the man who took the wheel, that is indestructible. So, the next time you feel like the system is too big, too corrupt, or too powerful to change, think of that night in Charleston Harbor. Think of the darkness, the cold water, and the massive guns of Fort Sumter pointing right at you. Think of the fear in the pit of your stomach. And then, think of Robert Smalls putting on that straw hat, crossing his arms, and blowing that whistle. He did not ask for permission to be free. He did not wait for someone to open the gate. He sailed right through it. He is the captain. He showed us the way. Now, it is our turn to take the wheel. If this story of the greatest heist in American history inspired you, if you believe that Robert Smalls deserves to be a household name, then do the one thing the system hates most: share this video. The algorithms do not like history that makes people uncomfortable. They want to bury this just like the history books did. Do not let them. Like, comment Captain Smalls, and subscribe to ensure that the stories of the unwanted, the erased, and the heroic are never forgotten. They tried to sink him. They failed. Let us make sure his legend sails forever.